Thank you guys for tuning in today and welcome to another episode of The Source. I'm your host, Zain Raza, and today we'll be talking to historian and the director of the Nuclear Studies Institute at the American University, Peter Kuznick. Peter also co-authored the book with Hollywood film director and producer Oliver Stone called The Untold History of the United States. Peter, thank you so much for your time today.
Always glad to be with you, Zane.
I would like to start with some current developments in Ukraine. Beginning of December, President Macron stated that the only way to end this war is with negotiations. He also had a joint news conference with President Biden at the White House, in which Biden later said that he would consider talks with Putin to end the war. But now we see the Biden administration crossing a new line by signaling to send Patriot defense missile systems to Ukraine. Will these Patriot missiles de-escalate the war, and what is your overall assessment of the war thus far?
Well, clearly, Patriot missiles won't de-escalate the war, and they're not intended to de-escalate the war. The sad calculation on both sides seems to be that peace is not a short-term option. So both sides are digging in. Russia had its call up of 300,000 more troops. The West, NATO, and the US have been providing more and more powerful defense systems that have also offensive capabilities. So we see both sides digging in. CIA Director William Burns has said recently that seems to be no interest on the Russian side for peace negotiations. Zelensky has said the same. Putin has said the same. The evidence seems to be that Putin is digging in for a long war. He's made some comments to that effect, that they're in this for the long term. And their strategy appears to be, since their strategy does not make a lot of sense militarily, their strategy seems to be that they can outlast the West, that the West is going to suffer economically, that the Europeans, as well as the Ukrainians, are going to suffer through a cold winter when they're not going to have sufficient energy to heat their homes, and that they're going to lose interest in this war. The United States is trying to send the opposite message. Zelensky is coming to Washington today. He's going to be meeting with Biden. He's going to be addressing a joint session of Congress. And the U.S. message is, we're with you. The interesting development in the U.S. is that the Republicans now are going to be taking over control of the House of Representatives. There are some people in both parties who are urging a diplomatic ramp as well. And a group of progressive Democrats issued a statement calling on the Biden administration, while in addition to providing military and non-military aid, to also be pursuing diplomacy. However, for various reasons, they retracted that almost instantaneously, amidst lots of apologies for having issued it when they did. But there are also a faction of Republicans, some of whom are MAGA Republicans, strange as that might seem, from an isolationist perspective, who want to also cut back on U.S. military aid. Then there are some sane people who say, look, what we're doing is raising the risk of World War III, and nobody wants to see that. So the things could change a little bit, the politics of it in the United States. But clearly Biden is doubling down, and the United States is providing Patriot missile systems now. It's part of the announcement that's expected to come out. The U.S. is going to announce almost $2 billion in additional military aid to Ukraine today, including Patriot missile systems. We know that things seem to have stabilized. The Russian retreat from Kharkiv, which was a disastrous retreat, the Russian retreat from Kherson, which was an orderly retreat. The Russians have dug in. There seems to be the kind of World War I trench warfare going on now, where each side moves a few kilometers and then loses it, and they go back and forth. Both sides are sustaining very heavy casualties. We've had General Milley and von Leyden, both saying that that Ukraine has lost 100,000 soldiers and another 20,000 civilians. The estimate is that Russia has also lost approximately 100,000 soldiers. So that's a very heavy toll. It's important to remember, if you read anything in the United States, I'm not sure in Germany, but probably the same, in the United States, every article that you read says this is the worst fighting in Europe, the worst bloodshed in Europe since World War II. What they don't say is that, yeah, that's true, this is the worst we've seen in Europe, but on a global scale, we've also seen much, much worse. Okay, so if we say that 120,000 Ukrainians have died, when Robert McNamara came into my class a few years ago, he said he accepted that 3.8 million Vietnamese died in the Vietnam War. If you do the math there, what is that? 30, quickly, is that 30 times as bad, or maybe 300 or whatever? So, you have to have some perspective on this. This is horrible what's going on there. And the people are suffering on all sides. And it's got global repercussions, as we've seen. It's affecting hunger in Africa. It's affecting people around the planet. It's inflation everywhere, crazy energy prices, fertilizer, other essential things that people need, aside from the bloodshed that's going on and the waste of human resources. Uh, but you compare it with the U.S. invasion of Vietnam, the U.S. invasion of Iraq, U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, these other things that have gone on, and it is horrible, and Putin should be condemned, and it is illegal, it is immoral, and the repercussions of the possibility of this kind of standoff between two nuclear armed powers is mind-boggling and how dangerous, insanely dangerous this is. Uh, but the United States cannot be claiming the moral high ground here quite the way it is, even though it happens to be on the right side in this crisis. But the U.S. has been fanning the flames, and fanning the flames is not the answer to this, and can only lead to more bloodshed, longer war, and more fighting. Not that Putin is ready to negotiate, but we have to begin these discussions.
You touched upon that the statement for providing a different route, a ramp towards peace diplomacy was redacted. Why is the left or the Democrats no longer a voice for diplomacy and anti-war and peace? And why do you think that this is the case, that this sort of statements gets redacted?
Well, the Democrats, this is not your grandfather's Democratic Party. This is not the party of Roosevelt and Henry Wallace. This is the party of Truman, the party of Johnson, of Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton. These are the centrist Democrats, and their foreign policy, including Biden's foreign policy, tends to be somewhere centrist to neoconservative. Biden surrounded himself, when he came into office, with 18 top advisors from the Center for New American Security. These are the hawks. They're China hawks especially. These are the ones who are the brains behind Hillary Clinton's Asia pivot, which she announced in that Foreign Policy Magazine article, November 2011, titled America's Pacific Century. She calls for the Asia pivot. Who were the advisors on that one? It was Sullivan. It was Campbell. These are the people who are making policy now. And you put that together with Blinken. And Blinken supported the invasion of Iraq, the invasion of Afghanistan, the invasion of Libya. These are not peaceniks. These are hawks, the Biden people. And they also believe in U.S. hegemony. And what Biden announced was that America is going to be back. The United States is going to be number one again. Where after the years of the Trump debacle, now the United States is going to reassert itself as the world's hegemon. And Biden has been doing that, and he managed to unify Europe. And he did nothing to try to prevent this invasion of Ukraine. In some ways, it's very reminiscent of that happened in 1979, when Brzezinski very deliberately fan the flames of Islamic extremism. And then on July 4th, 1979, when the U.S. starts giving military aid to the Mujahideen, Brzezinski sends a memo to Carter saying that Russia is going to now have to invade Afghanistan. The Russian invasion doesn't take place until Christmas, but they knew back in July that what they were doing was going to provoke a Russian invasion. And the people who the U.S. was supporting, their main grievance was that the pro-Russian government in Afghanistan was educating women. And the people who the U.S. was supporting was going in there and skinning teachers alive for educating women. So we were supporting the real right-wing reactionaries, the Islamic extremists, the zealots, because we wanted to provoke the Russian invasion of Afghanistan. And Brzezinski celebrated. And he says this is going to give Russia its own Vietnam. Well, we don't have the evidence yet, document-wise, but it smells like the same thing. Because the United States could have easily said that NATO is off the picture for Ukraine. NATO's out of the picture now, because NATO was out of the picture. But they wouldn't do that, even though now we know that Putin's thinking went beyond simply NATO, but NATO was a huge factor and had been a huge factor in Putin's thinking from the 1990s when NATO began its expansion. Other people recognize it. Were there other things going on in Putin's mind? He says that he was invading there to rid Ukraine of neo-Nazis and drug dealers who were running Ukraine. Well, that's pretty crazy and delusional. He said that Ukraine is always part of Russia. Well, don't ask the Ukrainians because they didn't believe that. There are a lot of things that Putin said and did that made no sense. And he also totally miscalculated in this invasion, which he subsequently admitted, that he thought it was going to be a cakewalk, that they would march right into Kyiv and take over. Well, Putin was surrounded by the kind of yes men who did not give him the intelligence, and he later admitted to Naftali Bennett, the Israeli president, that he was wrong, initially in what his calculations. And this has been a disaster for Russia. This, not only is Putin and Russia, are they pariahs, but they've certainly made a mockery of the Russian military. They've hurt the Russian economy long term. It hasn't had the immediate impact that people anticipated when they were predicting a 15% drop in Russian GDP. Well, that hasn't happened, but there is a significant drop right now, and the long-term effects of this are going to be terrible. So, this is no way, when people say that Russia hasn't learned this lesson and it's a threat to the Baltics and it's a threat to Europe and Poland, and they're wrong. If Russia cannot defeat Ukraine, it is not going to go to war with NATO. Putin might be delusional in certain respects and misguided in others, but he's not a madman, and he doesn't want to see the suicide of his country. So there's so much blame to go around. Again, this could have been prevented. It should have been prevented with diplomacy. There are people who I'm in touch with in the U.S. who deny that Russia has any national security interests at stake here. They see this as pure Russian imperialist aggression. Well, I don't agree with that perspective. I think that Russia has serious security concerns. The expansion of NATO to its doorstep after they promised back in 1990 that NATO would not expand 1 inch to the east, and we've American diplomats and statesmen have known for years that this was dangerous. We were crossing Russia's red lines. As the CIA director, William Burns, said in 2008, when he was U.S. ambassador to Russia, and the U.S. started talking about fast-tracking Ukraine and Georgia, he wrote back a memo to the White House, "Niet means niet. Don't cross Russia's red lines." Well, we did, and this was a predictable response, even though it was not a justifiable response.
You talked about the Nazism thing being not a legitimate reason to go to war, but the counter arguments that I usually hear is that the Azov battalion became part of the Ukrainian National Guard, that there was a lot of neo-Nazism or right-wing forces in around Zelensky that followed the philosophy of Stefan Bandera. And although there's no way, I think, in my view, that Russia has no role to play to clear any country of Nazism, I think that's against international law. Nevertheless, the argument is made that this also provoked and was a reason why Russia invaded. How legitimate do you hold this argument for?
I'd say I don't give any credence to that argument. Yeah, there were Nazis in Ukraine. There were Nazis in Ukraine for a long time. They killed some of my relatives, uh, you know, and the Azov Battalion was a neo-Nazi formation, and they did have some influence, and they did play a provocative role in the Donbass. But Ukraine is not the only country that's got neo-Nazis. Look at the United States. A lot of these Trump supporters, the January 6th insurrectionists, are neo-Nazis. Look at Germany. We've got the rise of neo-Nazi parties in Germany. We've got the recent coup attempt in Germany. You've got the AFP. I mean, we can look everywhere, and it's very sad and very dangerous. And we see the rise of neo-Nazism. And Russia has not been the anti-fascist force that it should have been. I mean, Russia has been playing footsies with right-wingers in France and other places when it serves Russia's interests. So these are fascist forces. They might not all be World War II neo-Nazis like we have in Ukraine, but that is not a justification. And what I see going on in Russia internally now is very distressing. I know people who have fled Russia. We've had hundreds of thousands of the best and the brightest fleeing from Russia because they can't speak. The Russian media, the opposition media, has been shut down. There used to be a pretty vibrant opposition media in Russia. That's been shut down. People get arrested for telling the truth about this invasion. And a lot of people have fled. And then with the recent mobilization of 300,000 people, tens of thousands more young people have fled because they don't want to be mobilized and to fight in this war. So, you know, I don't like what's going on inside Russia. I don't like the crackdown. I don't like the anti-democratic tendencies inside Russia. I don't see it as a fascist state. Some people do. I don't see it as a total dictatorship, but it is a kind of authoritarian state that I certainly wish it weren't. And they're cracking down and they're anti-woke, they're anti-gay and lesbian, they're anti-Western culture. They're moving very much toward the East in ways that are unfortunate. The big picture of what's happened this year is we see the polarization that's going on. It's not a complete polarization, but we see Russia and China leading lots of other countries into an anti-Western bloc. We see the solidification of the Western bloc as well, and we're going back to what we had in the Cold War. Two military blocs they still have economic ties, but a lot of those economic ties are being severed. I mean, that's one of the things that makes this different from the Cold War, is China, the role that China plays with Germany, for example, but Europe as a whole. And the Europeans have said they don't want to be forced to choose sides between the United States and China, but the U.S. has been pushing them to do that. But then we see the rise of the BRICS and the SCO, and we see one of the interesting things is so much of the world, more than half the world, has refused to go along with U.S. NATO sanctions on Ukraine. Certainly Germany and the Europeans have gone along, but much of the world has refused to do so. And it's not just India, and it's not just China, but it's most of Africa and Latin America. And part of the reason they do that is because they say the United States is trying to make this moral argument. This is the worst thing that we've ever seen happen. And reality, we've seen what you've done in Asia. We've seen you intervene time after time in Asia in wars costing millions of lives. We've seen your policy. And so while, yeah, this is terrible and nobody really, maybe Lukashenko, but very few people support Russia's invasion, but they do not want to go along with this bifurcated, bipolar world because they know how dangerous and destructive it is.
I'd like to take a step back and examine the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, which nearly triggered a nuclear confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union. For our young viewers, could you briefly recap the Cuban Missile Crisis, talk about the parallels with the Ukraine war, and what lessons can be learned from that time to prevent further escalation?
Yeah, I did a session at the Vatican recently with Jeffrey Sachs and Kerry Kennedy uh, and Martin Hellman, uh, which we were talking about the lessons of the Cuban Missile Crisis, because we just lived through the 60th anniversary, and that's the closest we've come to nuclear annihilation. But if you trace the roots of the Cuban Missile Crisis, it really starts with the U.S. dropping the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which was done largely to send a message to the Soviet Union of what they're going to get and worse if they interfere with U.S. plans in Europe or in the Pacific. And they took that lesson to heart. And so they tested their atomic bomb 4 years after the U.S. But the U.S. tested its hydrogen bomb in 1952, and Russia tested its hydrogen bomb in 1953. We now know it wasn't a full hydrogen bomb, but a prototype. And so they're catching up. And then in 57, when they launched Sputnik, much of the world thought they had caught up. And so Kennedy and the Democrats run on the idea that Eisenhower and Nixon had allowed a missile gap to develop, that the United States was behind the Soviets in terms of missiles and number and technology, and that the U.S. was very vulnerable as a result. That was one of Kennedy's main themes in attacking Nixon when he got elected in 1960. And when he gets in office, he asks McNamara, Secretary of Defense, to figure out what the truth really is. And McNamara reports back quickly, there is no missile gap. But then in September, I think it was September of 61, Roswell Gilpatrick gives a speech that Dan Ellsberg had actually written, saying that not only is there not a missile gap, but the U.S. is ahead, vastly ahead, in every military area. And the U.S. was ahead between 10 to 1 and 100 to 1 in every aspect, in number of weapons, in delivery systems, in bombers, in missiles, everything. But because the U.S. had run on this basis, McNamara was constrained. The SAC, the Strategic Air Command, wanted the U.S. to develop 3,000 more intercontinental ballistic missiles. Other branches had other estimates. McNamara thought the lowest number he could get away with was 1,000 more ICBMs. Russia had 4 at the time that were operative, and a few more by the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. How was this interpreted in the Kremlin? They interpreted that the U.S., which already was vastly superior, is adding 1,000 more because they're planning for a first strike to wipe out the Soviet Union. That was how it was interpreted inside the Soviet Union. And the U.S. did develop war plans, which Kennedy was briefed on, and walked out in the middle of the briefing on a preemptive first strike against the Soviet Union. LeMay wanted to do it, General Curtis LeMay, as did Lemnitzer to a lesser extent, but to some extent. And Kennedy walked out and says to Dean Rusk, and we call ourselves the human race. Kennedy, was appalled by this. And we're lucky because Khrushchev was also appalled by the threat of a nuclear war. When Khrushchev was briefed back in 52 or 53 on nuclear weapons, he said he couldn't sleep for days. So they both had been involved in World War II. They both knew what war was, and they had enough of a sense of what nuclear war was. And so Khrushchev makes a colossal blunder in 2 ways. Number one, he knows the U.S. is preparing for an invasion of Cuba to overthrow the Cuban government. So we start in April of 61 with the Bay of Pigs. But then in the fall of 61, we've got plans in place to actually invade. And one of our big exercises in the Caribbean was called Operation Ortsac. And Ortsac is Castro spelled backwards. And that was a decapitation raid and taking over the government. The U.S. had already put into place Operation Mongoose, which was a terrorist campaign to assassinate Castro and to destroy the Cuban economy, which we were enacting massive CIA operation. And now we were planning for this invasion. So Khrushchev thinks that if he puts nuclear weapons inside Cuba, number one, it'll prevent the US invasion and overthrowing the government. And number two, it'll start to redress the imbalance in nuclear capabilities. Khrushchev's huge blunder, however, was he didn't announce that the missiles were there with the nuclear weapons. Had he announced that they were there, it would have been a deterrent, and the U.S. could not have invaded. It would have been off the table, the U.S. invasion. But the U.S. doesn't know that those weapons are there. They don't know that the weapons have arrived, that that they were ready to go, uh, and they also didn't know that there were 100 battlefield nuclear weapons inside Cuba. In fact, McNamara doesn't find that out till 1992, 30 years later, and he turns white. The U.S. calculation was that there were 10,000 armed Soviet personnel, 10,000 Soviet military personnel, and what was the number? I think 100,000 armed Cubans. Uh, the U.S. When we found was yeah, 10,000 Soviet troops and 100,000 armed Cubans. McNamara estimated if the U.S. invaded, we'd have 18,000 casualties and 2,500 dead. We later finds out that there were not 10,000 Soviet troops, 42,000 Soviet troops, not 100,000 armed Cubans, 270,000 armed Cubans. McNamara then ups the estimate and says we would have lost 25,000. When he finds out 30 years later that there were 100 battlefield nuclear weapons that would probably have been used, he says, well, we would have lost 100,000 men in an invasion. We would have definitely destroyed Cuba and very likely the Soviet Union. And that's how close we came. Because on October 27th, the day that Arthur Schlesinger, the White House advisor historian, said it was not only the most dangerous moment in the Cold War, it was the most dangerous moment in all human history. On that day, the U.S. was dropping depth charges on a Soviet submarine that was escorting some of the ships coming to Cuba with supplies, and they knocked out the power. The carbon dioxide levels were rising. People were passing out nearly lethal levels. The electricity was gone. People were fainting from the heat and the carbon dioxide. They couldn't reach the forces back in the Kremlin. So the commander on the ship, Savitsky, gives the order to fire his nuclear torpedo. He says, we're doing somersaults down here. The war has probably started. We're going to disgrace ourselves. And they ordered the firing of the nuclear torpedo. Fortunately for mankind, one of the other commanders, Arkhipov, talks him down. Had they fired, the nuclear war would have started, and the world would not be here today. And so, I mean, that's how close we came. It was insanity. But the lessons that were drawn by Kennedy and Khrushchev, they both knew they had lost control. When the Cubans or the Russians shot down that U-2 plane over Cuba, that was even though Khrushchev had ordered them not to do so. He knew that what was brewing. He knew that if the U.S. invaded, that all bets were off, that anything could happen. And so they both knew, Kennedy and Khrushchev both knew they'd lost control of the situation, and that when a crisis like this develops, it can't be managed. So later that month in October, Khrushchev writes an incredible letter to Kennedy, and he said, from evil, some good must come. He said, our people have both felt the burning flames of thermonuclear war. We've got to take advantage of this. We have to eliminate every conflict between us that could cause another crisis. And the U.S. was slow to respond. But when Kennedy encouraged Norman Cousins to go there and meet with Khrushchev and to tell him how serious Kennedy was about negotiations, and Khrushchev says something so true to Norman Cousins. He says, peace is the most important goal in the world. If we don't have peace and the nuclear bombs start to fall, what difference will it make whether we are communists or Catholic or capitalist or Chinese or Russians or Americans? Who could tell us apart? Who will be left to tell us apart? So Khrushchev and Kennedy both got that. And then they proceed in those last few months to have the first nuclear arms control deal. Kennedy then comes to American University, my university, in June of '63 and makes the most amazing presidential speech of the 20th century. And he calls for an end to the Cold War. And he calls for an end to the nuclear arms race. And he calls for peaceful negotiations and making the world safe for diversity. Uh, it was a totally visionary speech. But he also says something very important there. He says nuclear powers must avert those confrontations which bring an adversary to a choice of either a humiliating retreat or a nuclear war. To adopt that kind of course in the nuclear age would be evidence only of the bankruptcy of our policy or of a collective death wish for the world. I think that we have a collective death wish for the world right now because we are putting Putin in the position where he either faces a humiliating defeat or the use of nuclear weapons. We know that China and India have put pressure on Putin to stop his nuclear saber rattling. We know that Kadyrov from Chechnya has urged Putin, top Putin advisor and aide friend, to use his nuclear weapons in Ukraine. We know that Podolyak, a top advisor to Zelensky, has urged the West to use nuclear weapons as well. We know that when there was a recent misfire of Ukrainian missiles that landed in Poland and killed some people in Poland, and Zelensky immediately comes out and says that this was a Russian missile that had done this and that NATO had got immobilized in response to this, effectively calling for NATO to go to war with Russia, even though Biden and NATO said it was a Ukrainian missile. So we've got madmen on all sides here, making nuclear threats, saber rattling, creating a military confrontation with no off ramp and no appetite for diplomacy. And the U.S. position saying we're going to give you tens and scores of billions of dollars for weapons and other aid, but we're going to leave it entirely up to you to decide whether you want to negotiate. That's really wrong, and it's dangerous, and it makes no sense, and it's immoral also. So there's a lot of immorality, a lot of uh, a lot of recklessness uh, on all sides here. So I'm not optimistic, and uh, and if we don't get off this road to war, I'm afraid of the consequences. Not by deliberately, nobody wants to start a nuclear war, but by miscalculation, by accident, Russia getting bombed again. They've hit inside Russia pretty deep on several occasions now. The U.S. giving more and more weapon systems. We're giving weapon systems that Biden originally said we wouldn't give because he said it would be too provocative. But now NATO thinks that Russia is a paper tiger because the Russian military has been such an embarrassment in the field. And the Russian generals and Russian logistics, Russian supply lines, and Russian hardware has proven to be ineffectual or not what they were promised. But what they don't realize is that Russia has been working on modernizing its nuclear forces at least since the U.S. abrogated the ABM treaty back in 2002. And there is every reason to think that Russia is ahead in hypersonics, that Russia is competing in artificial intelligence, that Russia's nuclear program, it was March 1st, 2018, that Putin announced in his State of the Nation address that Russia now has 5 new nuclear weapons, all of which can circumvent U.S. missile defense. And, they haven't been tested in warfare. America's weapons haven't been tested in warfare either, fortunately. It's been 77 years since nuclear weapons were used in warfare. They've been used repeatedly in the same sense that a robber holding a gun to someone's head uses that gun without pulling the trigger. That's been the nature of the Cold War and the post-Cold War. We make nuclear threats constantly, but the world has gotten more dangerous, and we have got to figure out an off-ramp immediately. And that's why I always call on Modi when I'm on Indian TV, on Putin when I'm on Russian TV, to on Xi Jinping on Chinese TV to put pressure on Putin to negotiate. But what we know, the situation in Russia is actually very ominous because the pressure in Russia is not from the left, not from the anti-war side, it's from the right. And they're criticizing Putin for not of declaring war and fully mobilizing the Russian people. The evidence seems to indicate that Putin is happy when these dissidents and anti-war forces leave Russia, as they have by the hundreds of thousands, because he doesn't want the pressure from those people to have to moderate his course there. However, you've got a lot of Russian hardliners who are attacking Putin from the right for being too moderate in his war, despite the Buchas, despite the other reports of atrocities and war crimes, and the attacking the civilian energy systems and electrical grid and water supplies. They want him to go much further. Some want him to use nuclear weapons, others want a full mobilization of the Russian military. So we're in a precarious time.
I would like to end this interview by talking about what you mentioned, arms controls treaties. Can you talk about arms controls treaties that were done away over the last 20 years and what significance they have between the confidence between the United States and Russia in terms of Ukraine?
There is no confidence between the United States and Russia. There is no confidence between the United States and Iran. Why would the Iranians trust the U.S. after it just abrogated the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal? And the Iranian position, part of the reason why these negotiations have faltered, the Iranians say, sure, okay, so we signed another treaty with the U.S. under Biden. The Republicans are now going to take over the House. It's not actually a treaty even. The U.S. could not, Obama, it was his great foreign policy achievement, but he knew he could never get it through the Congress. So he made it a deal rather than a treaty because they wouldn't get the votes in the Senate to ratify a treaty. But even as whatever we call it, another deal, and it was not just the U.S., it was 5 nuclear nations and Germany who were behind this deal. But the Iranian argument, which makes sense, is what happens if the Republicans take control in 2024? What if it's not Trump, but some reasonable, Trump without all the baggage of his narcissism and sickness takes over, and the Republicans again would abrogate the treaty. So there's very little trust between the United States and Russia at this point. And we begin with the agreement over the unification of Germany in 1990, in which it wasn't just Bush and Baker who promised Gorbachev that NATO would not expand. It was 14 different or more world leaders. It was Dietrich Genscher. Everybody did. They all promised. But within the year, in 1990, before the year was out, NATO was already having planning meetings discussing expansion. It doesn't begin really until 1997, but the plans were in the works much, much earlier. And then it expands under Clinton. And then it expands under Bush. And it expands under Obama. And now it expands under Biden. So that's the first thing, that they believe they can't trust the United States. The second thing is the ABM Treaty. The U.S. pulls out of the ABM Treaty in 2002, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. And so now it can do all of its Star Wars and SDI experiments, and there's no more limits on that. Then the U.S. pulls out of the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which had created a certain kind of common stability in Europe. But Trump abrogates that also. Then the U.S. pulled out of the Open Skies Treaty. Now, with the INF Treaty, the U.S. said that the Russians were cheating on some of the missile programs. The Russians denied it, made countercharges, but this should have been handled through negotiations and diplomacy, but it wasn't. And then the United States pulls out of that. Then the Open Skies Treaty. But even the one piece of the strategic nuclear arms control architecture that was left, the New START Treaty, Trump didn't even want to renew that. There was a clause there that said you could renew that for up to 5 years. Fortunately, one of the first things that Biden did when he took office was to renew that for 5 years. Does anybody really believe we're going to have an extension or a new nuclear arms control treaty? Right now, all 9 nuclear powers are modernizing their nuclear arsenals. The U.S. is going to spend close to $2 trillion modernizing its nuclear arsenal. Russia has begun modernizing back in 2002. It's ahead of us in modernization, even in numbers, maybe capabilities, we don't know. China, according to the Pentagon, which we can't trust entirely, says China, which started off with 250 or so nuclear weapons, now has close to 400, plans to have 1,000 by the end of the decade and 1,500 by 2035. Britain is increasing its nuclear arsenal by 40%. All of them are doing this. We're caught in this cycle of insanity right now. And so the chances of any kind of arms control going forward, that's the danger right now. I used to say that there are two people that veto power over the future existence of life on our planet, Biden and Putin. Well, Xi Jinping looks like he wants to develop veto power. If China gets that, how far behind is India going to be? If India starts increasing its nuclear arsenal, what is Pakistan going to do? We see North Korea. How many missile tests have they had this year? They already have the capability to hit anywhere in the United States, and they're perfecting those capabilities. All the nuclear powers are doing so. And a new right-wing government in Israel, extreme right-wing governments in Sweden and Italy. The democracy is on the decline around the planet. In the U.S., we almost had, we had an insurrection last year. Now that hopefully they'll bring charges against Donald Trump. But democracy is very fragile. Peace is very fragile. Development is very fragile. Healthcare globally is very fragile. And the gap between rich and poor is growing. So the end of 2022, my prognosis is not very optimistic, except we're still here. And while we're here, we have no choice but to keep on doing everything we can to try to ensure that there's a future.
Everything we can to ensure the future. Nice words to end. Peter Kuznick, historian, author, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Zain.
And thank you guys for tuning in today. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and our alternative channels on Telegram and Rumble, and to donate to our year-end crowdfunding campaign so we can continue our independent journalism going forward in 2023. I'm your host, Zain Raza. See you guys next time.
These are the building blocks that make up our organization and the goals we would like to achieve. In order to continue our journalism and realize these values fundamental to our democracy, we need 1,000 supporters in our crowdfunding campaign, donating only €5 or dollars per month via Patreon or bank account. Right now, we have only 200 supporters and are not able to take the next step. Our future is in your hands. Strengthen independent journalism and be part of meaningful change.